Moonlight laid pale silver across the open prairie, and in that ghostly quiet, Elias Boone could hear it, ragged breathing, low and uneven, coming from the shadows of his barn. He held the lantern high, the light quivering in his hand. Something moved in the dark. Slow, deliberate. Then the shape stepped forward, and Boone's breath froze in his chest. A young man, barely more than 20, stood there swaying. His bare chest was streaked with dirt and blood, his hair hanging loose over his face. But what caught Boone's eyes was the mark. Black ink burned into skin just above the heart. A symbol Boone had seen only once before, in a night he'd spent a decade trying to forget. Elias Boone thought he'd buried that memory deep enough to never see daylight again. He was wrong. The young man's knees buckled. Boone caught him before he hit the ground, feeling the fever in his skin, the shiver in his bones. There was no weapon in sight, only the smell of blood and the faint copper tang of iron. Boone knew one thing for certain. This man didn't end up in his barn by accident, not with that mark. But let's go back to where it started. The sun had been burning low in the western sky, turning the grassland gold, when Boone brought his team in from the south pasture. His ranch sat 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, a small square of fence and timber carved into the endless Kansas plain. Most days, the only sound was wind and the soft knock of the windmill pulling water from the well. Boone had built this place with his own hands after the war, alone, the way he preferred it. Folks in town called him quiet, maybe even cold, but they also knew he paid his debts and minded his business. That was enough to keep them friendly at a distance. The autumn had been dry, the creek shrinking to a trickle. That evening, as Boone led his bay mare into the barn, he noticed the horses had been restless, ears flicking toward the tree line, muscles twitching like they could smell something he couldn't. He didn't think much of it. Coyotes passed through sometimes. The smell came first, sweat, damp earth, and the coppery bite of fresh blood, just faint enough to make a man question if it was real. Then came the sound. A soft scrape, like boots dragging against the packed dirt floor. Boone had stopped in the barn doorway, every sense on edge. When he found the boy, half naked, cut to ribbons, and marked with that cursed black symbol, he felt the years peel away. Back to the night outside Red Fork, when the firelight danced against the skin of a dying man wearing the same mark. Back to the moment Boone made a choice that saved his life and damned another. He dragged the young man into the lamplight. He was lean, his skin sun-browned beneath the streaks of dirt, his face sharp-boned and proud even in unconsciousness. A thin necklace hung around his neck, leather cord threaded with 2 eagle feathers and a single carved bead. Boone set him on a pile of old horse blankets, knelt beside him, and studied the wound at his side. It wasn't deep enough to kill him outright, but the infection was setting in. Whoever had done this had meant for him to suffer. "Hell," Boone muttered under his breath. There were choices to be made here. In this part of the country, an injured Comanche brave showing up on your property wasn't just trouble. It was a death warrant. The army still patrolled these parts. Settlers still whispered about raids and burned-out cabins. Folks didn't ask what started it. They just knew which side they stood on. And this boy, no man, had the mark of the Black Knives, a Comanche war band with a reputation for merciless justice. Boone poured water into a tin basin and began to clean the wound. The boy stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were dark, steady, and full of something Boone recognized. Pain, yes, but not fear. The man's lips moved, a word in a language Boone didn't understand. His voice was hoarse, the sound more breath than speech. "You're safe for now," Boone said, though they both knew that wasn't true. The boy's gaze flicked toward the barn doors, toward the moonlit prairie beyond, and Boone understood. Whoever had done this might still be out there. Or worse, they might be coming. Boone finished wrapping the wound and set the lantern down, leaning back against a hay bale. He knew he should ride into town, tell Marshal Tate what he'd found. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But he also knew what would happen if he did. The army didn't patch up Comanche braves. They buried them. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, ears pricked toward the open night. Boone glanced at the boy, who was already drifting back into a fevered sleep, and felt the weight settle on his chest. Some debts can stay buried for years, but when they rise, they don't come quietly. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, long and low. Boone sat in the dark, listening to the wind, and wondered just how far this trouble was willing to come, and when it did, whether he'd be ready to meet it. By dawn, frost clung to the grass like a thin veil of glass, crunching under Boone's boots as he stepped out to check the horizon. The prairie lay quiet in that deceptive way it sometimes did, still as a photograph, but hiding movement in its folds. The boy, no, the brave, was still asleep on the barn blankets, though his breathing had steadied. Boone had cleaned the wound again during the night, swapping out the bandages when the blood seeped through. His fever had broken for a while, but the chills were coming in waves. Boone pulled the barn door shut behind him and walked toward the main house. He was halfway up the porch steps when he saw the dust plume on the southern road. By the time the riders came close enough for Boone to make out their faces, he already knew who they were. Marshal Tate and his deputy, Rafe Gill, lay. Tate was a wiry man with a habit of staring too long at a man's eyes, like he could find the lie before you even spoke it. Gilly was younger, the kind of man who laughed quick, but never forgot a grudge. "Morning, Boone," Tate called, reining in his sorrel. "We heard there was trouble out this way." Boone's jaw tightened. "Trouble?" "Tracks," Tate said, tipping his chin toward the tree line. "Fresh ones, heading toward your place. Barefoot, bleeding. Guess that's what you get for living so far from town. Trouble comes to you first." Boone kept his voice even. "Haven't seen a soul all night." Tate studied him for a long moment. "Mind if we look around?" Boone didn't move. "My barn's not the army's business." Gilly shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "That's the thing, Boone. Army scouts rode through last night. Said a Comanche war party's been ranging this side of the river. One of 'em's missing. They want him found." The word Comanche hung in the air like a threat. Boone leaned a shoulder against the porch post. "You're telling me you'd bring him back alive?" Tate's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Don't reckon that's up to me." Silence stretched between them. Tate was no fool. He could read the tension in Boone's stance, but after a moment, the marshal nodded toward the road. "Just keep your eyes open. Folks out here are nervous." When they rode off, Boone stood on the porch until the dust settled back onto the road. Only then did he head back to the barn. The brave was awake now, propped up on one elbow. His dark eyes tracked Boone's every step. Boone set down a tin cup of water beside him. "You didn't tell them," the brave said, his English careful but clear. Boone crouched beside him. "Wasn't their business." The brave studied him, as if trying to place him in a memory. "You think I'm here to raid your cattle, burn your house?" Boone didn't answer. "Mine Miss Tahu," the young man said finally. "I came alone." Boone sat back on his heels. "Alone's not safe out here." Tahu's gaze hardened. "Safe is not real. Safe is something white men say to each other in towns with walls." It was said without heat, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen the truth too often. Boone knew he had to think fast. The town already had its suspicions, and if Tate came back with more men, this would end the way it always did. Blood and shallow graves. He didn't know Tahu's story yet. but he'd seen the cut at his side, the fever. Whoever had done that hadn't been trying to protect their home. They'd been hunting him. Later that morning, Boone rode into town for supplies. The general store was half full, mostly women picking up flour and lamp oil, a few men swapping news by the stove. Conversation died a little when Boone walked in. Clara Mays, the storekeeper's wife, handed him a bag of sugar and said, "You seen the marshal yet? Folks say there's Indians prowling the South Road." Boone kept his tone light. "Haven't seen anything worth losing sleep over." Old Ezra Cobb spat into the stove's ashtray. "That's 'cause you don't look, Boone. Folks around here got a right to be worried. We remember Red Fork." Boone's stomach turned at the name. Red Fork. The night he'd made the choice that still burned in the back of his mind. He paid for his goods without another word. On the ride home, the sky had turned a low gunmetal grey, promising rain. Boone found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, not at the horizon, but at the thought of who might be watching from just beyond it. When he reached the ranch, Tahu was standing in the barn doorway, pale but upright. Boone swung down from his horse. "You can't be out here," Boone said. "If someone rides by—" "I am not your prisoner," Tahu cut in, "but I will not bring trouble to your door." Boone let out a slow breath. "Trouble's already here, son." They locked eyes for a long moment, and Boone felt the weight of what he was doing settle into his bones. He could turn this man over to the marshal, wash his hands of it, and no one in town would think less of him. Hell, they'd probably buy him a drink. Instead, he said, "Get back inside. We'll figure this out." It was a decision he knew he couldn't take back. That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, distant beat of a drum. Not fast, not urgent, just steady, like a heartbeat rolling across the plains. Boone stood in the dark, listening. Tahu, sitting on the barn blankets, didn't move. "They are looking for me," he said quietly. Boone didn't ask who they were. He already knew. And he also knew they'd find him. The night fell thick and starless, the kind that swallows light whole. Boone didn't light the lamps. No sense in drawing eyes to the ranch. He sat at the table with his rifle laid across his lap, the slow ticking of the wall clock marking the silence between them. Tahu stayed in the barn, though Boone had told him he could come inside. There was a pride about the young man, the kind that wouldn't accept the charity of walls when he could make do with hay and a blanket. Boone respected it. He also knew it made them more exposed. Sometime after midnight, the wind shifted again, and Boone caught it. Wood smoke, faint but deliberate. Not the clean, thin smell of a cook fire. This was heavier, older, the kind that clung to hides and hair. He stood and crossed to the window. The prairie stretched black in every direction, but somewhere out there, past the fence, beyond the low ridge, someone was burning something. Tahu appeared in the doorway, barefoot in the dirt, his eyes fixed on the same horizon Boone had been watching. "They are close," he said. His voice was steady, but the words were heavy, like they carried more than distance. Boone asked, "How many?" Tahu didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, listening. "More than you have bullets for." Boone's grip tightened on the rifle. The next morning brought no comfort. The sky was the pale, washed-out color of old tin, and the grass whispered under a cold wind. Boone saddled the mare and rode the fence line, eyes scanning for movement. He saw nothing, just the same empty plains, the same faint thread of smoke on the northern horizon. By midday, he found tracks, a cluster of them, coming in from the west. Barefoot, light, deliberate. Boone crouched to touch the earth. The edges of the prints were crisp. Whoever made them had passed through in the night. When he returned to the barn, Tahu was waiting. Boone didn't have to speak. The young man could read it in his face. "They are black knives," Tahu said low. "My people, but not my band. They do not ask questions before they take blood." Boone remembered the mark on Tahu's chest. "And they'll take yours too?" A shadow crossed Tahu's expression. "They already tried." Boone didn't press. He could feel the line between what Tahu would share and what he would not. That afternoon, Boone heard riders coming up the road again. This time it wasn't the marshal. It was 3 men from town. Ezra Cobb, young Rafe Gilly, and a stocky man Boone knew only as Maya, who ran cattle north of the river. Ezra called out before dismounting. "Boone, you seen anything? We've been hearing drums. Folks are nervous." Boone leaned on the corral fence, calm. "You'll hear drums plenty if you go looking for 'em." Maya spit into the dirt. "Ain't looking. They're coming this way. And when they do, anyone harboring one of 'em, well, you know what that means." Rafe's eyes scanned the barn. "Heard tell someone matching the missing Brave's description was seen limping south of the ridge. You been out that way?" Boone met his gaze evenly. "Can't say I have." The 3 men lingered a moment too long before riding off. Boone watched the dust rise behind them and knew it wouldn't be the last. Time they came. By nightfall the drums were closer. Not loud enough to rattle the air, but steady, like a slow pulse just beneath the surface of the land. Boone stepped onto the porch and saw Tahu standing in the yard, his face turned toward the sound. The wind tugged at his hair, the eagle feathers at his necklace swaying. "They are telling me to come," Tahu said. Boone asked, "What happens if you don't?" Tahu's eyes found his. "They will take me, and they will take you, because you have touched me." Boone thought of Tate, of the townsfolk's stares in the store, of Red Fork. He thought of the way blood always seemed to run the same color, no matter whose hand spilled it. "Then we'd better be ready," Boone said. They made small preparations, the quiet kind. Boone checked the rifle, laid out extra rounds. Tahu sharpened a skinning knife, the movement slow and careful. Neither of them spoke much. Around midnight, Boone heard it. Hoofbeats, faint but coming closer. Not the scatter of a few riders, but the slow, measured rhythm of many. His stomach tightened. Tahu was already at the barn doors, peering into the dark. "They will not ride all the way in," he said. "Not yet. They will watch." Boone felt it before he saw it. Eyes on them from the blackness beyond the yard. The kind of watching that made the hair on a man's neck stand on end. Then, out by the ridge, a torch flared. Another followed. Then 3 more. A line of slow-moving fire, far enough away to keep their shapes hidden. Boone raised the rifle, but Tahu put a hand on the barrel. "If you shoot now, there will be no talking." Boone lowered it. "You think there's going to be talking?" Tahu's voice was quiet, but certain. "There will be words before blood. That is their way." Boone nodded once. "Then we'll hear them." The torches held their distance, but Boone knew that come morning, the choice would be standing in his yard, and there wouldn't be much room left for words. The morning came pale and windless, the kind where sound carried for miles. Boone stood on the porch with a tin mug of coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't have to look far. The black knives were already there. They stood just beyond the fence line, 20 or more, their ponies restless under them. The riders didn't shout, didn't move fast. They just watched. The only sound was the faint creak of saddle leather and the slow toss of a horse's head. Tahu came from the barn, walking stiffly but with his head high. Boone saw the way the warband's leader, a tall man with a broad chest and a coat stitched from buffalo hide, watched him approach. The man's face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned. Tahu stopped at the fence. Boone stayed a few paces back, rifle in hand but lowered. The leader spoke in Comanche first. his voice deep and steady. Boone didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. There was accusation in them. Tahu replied in the same tongue, his voice harder, quicker. The exchange carried a rhythm, statements and counterstatements, like blows in a fight that had started long before either of them was born. Finally, the leader switched to English. His words were for Boone now. "You have our blood in your barn," he said. "He has done what cannot be forgiven. He belongs to us." Boone met the man's gaze. "He's wounded. He needs time." "He needs to answer," the leader said. "You keep him. You take his debt." Boone didn't glance at Tahu, but he felt the weight of his silence. "What's his debt?" The leader's eyes narrowed. "He turned his back when our brother fell. He carries our mark, but he does not carry our honor." Boone let that settle. He didn't know the truth of it, only that whatever had happened, Tahu's people saw him as a man who had failed them, and in the old ways, that failure could only be paid for in blood. "Give him to us," the leader said. "This is not for you." Boone could have done it then, stepped aside, let them take him, and ended the staring match before it turned into something worse. But when he finally looked at Tahu, he didn't see a coward or a traitor. He saw the same thing he'd seen in himself years ago at Red Fork, a man standing alone in a world that wanted him gone. Boone shook his head. Not today. The leader's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He looked at Tahu one last time, said something sharp in Comanche, then turned his horse. The warband followed, their ponies kicking up thin clouds of dust as they rode back toward the ridge. Boone knew that wasn't the end. That was the beginning of the wait. They stayed close to the barn the rest of the day. Boone worked the chores in silence while Tahu sat sharpening the knife again, each slow stroke a quiet preparation. Around mid-afternoon, Boone came in with a bucket of water and set it down. "You going to tell me?" Boone asked. Tahu didn't look up. "Tell you what?" "What you did." For a long time, Tahu kept working the blade. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "There was a raid. We were sent against soldiers, blue coats. My brother was taken. I saw him fall. I did not go back." Boone frowned. "You'd have been killed." "That is the way of it," Tahu said simply. "To leave him was to leave myself. They see no difference." Boone leaned against the wall. "And that mark?" Tahu's hand went to the tattoo over his heart. "It means I swore never to turn away. Now it means I lied." Boone felt the sting of that in his own chest. At Red Fork, he'd made a choice to live when others had died because of it. He knew the weight of walking away. That evening, Boone brought out something from the house, a small, faded tintype in a leather case. He set it on the crate beside Tahu. "My family," Boone said. "Taken in Missouri during the war. I wasn't there. Came back to a house that was just ashes." Tahu studied the image. A woman with kind eyes, a little girl on her lap, a boy standing straight beside her. "You could not save them?" Boone nodded. "No, but I still hear people say I should have." For a while, neither man spoke. The prairie wind moved through the barn, bringing with it the smell of smoke again. Closer now, richer, as if the war band had settled for the night within striking distance. "They will come at dawn," Tahu said quietly. Boone didn't ask how he knew. Some things you didn't need proof for. "You could run," Boone said. Tahu met his gaze. "And leave you?" "No." It wasn't defiance. It was something closer to gratitude, though it sat in the young man's voice like an unfamiliar guest. When the sun went down, Boone lit only one lamp, placing it low to the ground. The rest of the barn was shadow. Outside, the land was darker still. Every sound seemed magnified. The rustle of grass, the creak of the windmill, the faint jingle of a horse's bridle somewhere out in the black. Boone laid the rifle across his knees and looked at Tahu. "If this goes bad, you stay low. Don't try to—" "I will not hide," Tahu said. Boone didn't push it. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote cried. Then, softer still, came the murmur of many voices speaking in low tones. Boone knew what that meant. The Black Knives weren't leaving in the morning. They were already here. The dawn broke in a thin, pale line across the eastern prairie, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods. Boone had been awake all night, listening to the soft murmur of voices outside the fence, the occasional stamp of a restless pony. When the sun finally rose high enough to catch the tops of the grass, they came. The Black Knives rode in without haste, moving like a tide that knew it would reach the shore. 20 riders fanned out in a crescent around the yard, their leader at the center. The torches from the night before were gone. This was not a time for fire. This was a time for ending. Tahu stood beside Boone, his knife at his belt, his wound bound tight. He looked thinner in the light, but taller too, like a man walking toward what could not be avoided. The leader dismounted, boots sinking into the dust. He stopped just shy of the porch and spoke in Comanche. Tahu answered in the same language, his tone even, unflinching. Boone couldn't understand the words, but he could read the rhythm, the leader accusing, Tahu defending, both unwilling to yield. Then the leader looked to Boone. "You have kept him," the man said. "Now you must decide. Do you stand in his place or step aside?" Boone's eyes went to Tahu. "Is there no other way?" The leader's jaw worked. The other way was for him to die with his brother. That time is gone. Tahu stepped forward, closing the space between himself and the man who had come to take him. He spoke again in Comanche, his voice quieter now, almost weary. The leader's expression shifted, just slightly, but Boone caught it. The older warrior glanced at Boone, then back at Tahu, and said something that carried the weight of a verdict. The warband stirred, but none drew a weapon. Tahu turned to Boone. "He says I may live," he translated, "but not among them." It wasn't mercy. It was exile. Boone exhaled slowly. "Then you'll stay here." The leader mounted his horse again, never taking his eyes from Tahu. "You keep him. You keep his shadow," he said in English. "It will follow you both." And with that they turned and rode away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the wide silence of the plains. For a long time after they were gone, Boone and Tahu stood in the yard, listening to the empty wind. Boone finally broke the stillness. "You could go south, find your mother's people, or head for the mountains." Tahu shook his head. "Wherever I go, I carry the mark. Here is as good as anywhere." Boone studied the young man's face, the resolve in it. He'd seen men destroyed by exile, hollowed out by the knowledge that they belonged nowhere. But he'd also seen a few take that emptiness and make something out of it. Boone pointed toward the fence line. "That east pasture's a mess. You feel up to mending it, I'll show you how." Tahu's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "I can work." Weeks passed. The talk in town faded some, though Boone caught the looks when he rode in for supplies. Nobody asked outright, but word had a way of drifting. Sometimes at night, Boone would hear Tahu speaking quietly in his own tongue as he sat in the barn, the firelight throwing shadows up the walls. Boone never asked what he said. Some things were meant to stay between a man and the wind. One cold evening, Boone came in from the pasture to find Tahu looking at the tintype again. The young man held it carefully, as though afraid to smudge the faces with his fingers. "She had kind eyes," Tahu said. Boone nodded. "She did." Tahu set the case down gently. "You still carry their shadow." Boone met his gaze. Yeah. Guess we both do. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn boards. Boone poured them both coffee and handed one over. It wasn't peace. Not entirely. But it was something close enough to build on. Years later, folks would still tell the story in low tones, how the rancher had turned away a Comanche warband without firing a shot. Some swore the young brave stayed for a season, others said he rode off before the next spring. But Boone never corrected them. The truth wasn't theirs to measure. The truth was that in a wide land built on debts and shadows, sometimes the best a man could do was keep another from being buried in his. And that was enough.